The year was 1881, and the Texas plains were a study in loneliness. For Ezra Weston, the landscape was a mirror. It stretched out in every direction, vast and empty, under a sky that seemed to hold its breath, reflecting the hollow space inside his own chest. His ranch was an island in a sea of grama, grass and mesquite, a place where the wind was the most constant companion, and its voice was a mournful howl that scraped at the edges of his sanity. He was a man carved from the same hard earth he worked, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands calloused from labor and a face weathered by sun and sorrow. Grief had settled into the lines around his eyes, a permanent etching left behind by his wife, Martha, who had been stolen by a fever 2 winters past. She had been the heart of their home, the quiet center around which their chaotic world revolved. Now, that center was gone, and Ezra was left adrift with the 5 pieces of her she had left behind. His daughters, Abigail, the eldest at 16, wore her responsibility like a heavy cloak, her face a thundercloud of premature worry. Hannah, 14, was the quiet observer, her eyes missing nothing. 11-year-old Cora was a bundle of nervous energy, always flitting from one task to another. Esther, at 8, still asked when Mama was coming home from her long sleep beneath the cottonwood tree. And then there was Rose, only 5, a sunbeam of a child who remembered her mother only in whispered stories. They filled the small ranch house with a cacophony of life, with arguments and laughter, with tangled hair and torn dresses, with the constant, pressing weight of their needs. Yet, in the midst of it all, Ezra felt a loneliness so profound it was like a physical ache. His days were a relentless cycle of duty. Before the sun bled color into the eastern sky, he was up, lighting the stove, his movements clumsy in the kitchen that had once been Martha's domain. He cooked lumpy oatmeal, braided hair with fingers too big for the delicate strands, and mended fences that seemed to break out of sheer spite. He rode the lonely fence lines, his gaze scanning the horizon not for stray cattle, but for some answer that never came. He was a father and a rancher, but he had also become a seamstress, a cook, a nurse, and a storyteller, and he was failing at all of it. The silence of adult companionship was a deafening roar that the chatter of 5 young girls could never quite drown out. It was after a dust storm, one of those malevolent brown walls that scoured the land and blotted out the sun, that his life's brittle routine was shattered. The air was thick with grit, the world painted in shades of ochre and sepia. He was riding the southern perimeter, checking for downed fences, the wind still whipping his collar against his cheek. That's when he saw a splash of color against the monotonous brown. Not a wildflower, but a heap of beaded buckskin. He dismounted, his heart thudding a cautious rhythm against his ribs. As he drew closer, the heap resolved into the form of a person, a woman. She was lying face down, her dark hair fanned out around her, tangled with burrs and dust. He knelt, his movements slow, his hand hovering over her back. He could see the faint, shallow rise and fall of her breathing. She was alive. Gently he turned her over. She was young, her face etched with fine cheekbones and a strong jaw, now slack in unconsciousness. Her skin, the color of rich earth, was dry, and her lips were cracked. A dark bruise was blooming on her temple, and one of her ankles was twisted at an unnatural angle. She was Comanche. Her dress, the intricate beadwork, the style of her moccasins, all spoke of it. She was a world away from the settlers in the town of Redemption, a world that was often at odds with his own. A cold knot of indecision tightened in Ezra's gut. The fort was a 2-day ride, and they would see her not as a person in need, but as a problem, a savage. The town of Redemption was closer, but the prejudice there ran deep and ugly. Leaving her here was a death sentence. The storm had passed, but the sun was merciless, and the coyotes would be bold by nightfall. He looked at her still face, at the vulnerability of her unconsciousness. He thought of Martha, of her unwavering belief in doing the right thing, no matter how hard. He thought of his daughters, of the world he was trying to build for them. What kind of man would he be if he rode away? Cursing his conscience, his loneliness, and the unyielding land itself, he made his choice. With a grunt of effort, he gathered the woman into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but her presence was a profound weight, a responsibility that settled over him, heavier than any sorrow he had yet carried. He lifted her onto his horse, mounted behind her, and turned for home, the future a terrifying, unknown country stretching before him. The arrival of the woman who remained unconscious for the rest of the day and through the night sent ripples of chaos through the Western household. Abigail's face hardened with suspicion, her arms crossed tight over her chest. "What were you thinking, Pa? Bringing her here?" she demanded in a harsh whisper as Ezra laid the woman on a spare cot in the corner of the main room. "She would have died, Abby," Ezra said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Go fetch some water and clean cloths." Hannah watched from the doorway, silent and wide-eyed, while Cora hovered nervously behind her. It was little Rose who crept forward, her thumb in her mouth, her gaze fixed on the stranger's still face. "Is she a princess, Pa?" "No, Rosie, she's just lost." Ezra felt a pang in his chest. They were all lost, in one way or another. The woman finally woke the next morning. Her eyes, dark and deep as a forest pool, flew open and darted around the room, taking in the unfamiliar log walls, the iron stove, the curious faces of the children. When her gaze landed on Ezra, it sharpened with a wild, cornered animal fear. She tried to sit up, a cry of pain escaping her as she put weight on her injured ankle. "Easy," Ezra said, holding up his hands, palms open. "You're safe here. We mean you no harm." She didn't understand his words, but she understood the tone. Her fear remained, but the panic subsided into a wary, intense observation. She refused the oatmeal he offered, her eyes tracking his every move. It was Esther who broke the impasse. Hesitantly, she approached the cot, holding a tin cup of water. She didn't speak, just held it out. The woman watched her for a long moment, her gaze softening almost imperceptibly. Finally, she reached out a trembling hand and took the cup, drinking thirstily. They called her the stranger, for they did not know her name. Communication was a clumsy dance of gestures and guesswork. Ezra would point to his chest and say, "Ezra." The woman would only stare back, her silence a wall he could not breach. His daughters, however, were less inhibited. Rose would bring her treasure ace, a smooth river stone, a bird's feather, and lay them by the cot. Cora, overcoming her fear, demonstrated how to work the butter churn. Days turned into a week. The woman, who Ezra learned was named Kia, when she finally whispered it to Rose, began to heal. Her ankle, expertly splintered by Ezra, was still weak, but she could limp around the small cabin. Her silence remained, but her actions began to speak for her. She was a watcher, her eyes missing nothing. She saw the fraying cuff on Ezra's shirt and the way he winced when he moved his shoulder, strained from lifting a feed sack. She saw Abigail's resentment, Hannah's quiet curiosity, and the way the younger girls craved a mother's touch. One afternoon, Ezra came in from the fields, bone-weary and smelling of sweat and earth. He found the cabin strangely quiet. Kia was sitting in Martha's old rocking chair, a place no one had occupied for 2 years. On her lap was a sleeping Rose, her head nestled against Kia's shoulder. Kia was humming, a low, melodic sound that was both sad and soothing. In her hands was his work shirt, and with a needle and thread scavenged from Martha's sewing basket, she was mending the torn cuff with stitches so small and perfect they were nearly invisible. Ezra stopped in the doorway, his heart catching in his throat. The scene was an echo of a life he thought was lost forever, the quiet domesticity, the gentle sound, the simple act of care. Abigail stood by the hearth, watching with a conflicted expression, her usual hostility softened by a grudging respect. Kia looked up and her eyes met Ezra's. The humming stopped. For a moment, the wall of silence between them seemed to dissolve, replaced by a fragile thread of shared understanding. She wasn't a stranger anymore. She was Kia, and her presence was starting to fill the hollow spaces in his house and in his heart in a way he hadn't thought possible. The slow thaw of mistrust continued in the small, unspoken moments of their shared existence. Ezra found that Kia had a knowledge of the land that rivaled his own, but in a different way. She would limp out into the prairie and return with roots and leaves he'd always considered weeds, adding them to their bland stews to give them a savory, earthy flavor. She taught Cora how to weave strong cord from yucca fibers and showed Hannah how to track the movements of rabbits by signs Ezra had never noticed. Her bond with the youngest girls was the firmest bridge between their two worlds. She had a patience that Ezra, worn thin by worry and work, often lacked. She would sit with Esther for hours, showing her how to make dolls from corn husks, her hands moving with a fluid grace. With Rose, she was endlessly gentle, wiping away tears with a soft touch and telling stories in her own tongue. The girls didn't understand the words, but they understood the cadence, the love woven into the sounds. Ezra watched it all, a strange mix of gratitude and a feeling he dared not name stirring within him. He started leaving a wildflower on the table for her in the mornings, a splash of Indian paintbrush or a bluebonnet. She never acknowledged it with words, but he would see her tuck it into the band of her dress or place it in a cup of water by her cot. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was full of a quiet communication, a language of gestures and shared glances that spoke more than words ever could. One evening, a cool front moved in, bringing a sigh of relief from the summer's oppressive heat. They sat around the fire after a simple meal. Rose, sleepy and content, was curled at Kia's feet. Abigail, for the first time, sat near them without her customary scowl, watching Kia's hands as she deftly braided a strip of leather. "My mother," Abigail said suddenly, her voice quiet. "She used to braid my hair like that." Kia looked up, her gaze soft in the firelight. She didn't understand the words, but she heard the note of sorrow in them. She reached out and, with a tentative finger, touched a loose strand of Abigail's hair, her expression one of profound empathy. The gesture was small, but it was enough. The last wall of Abigail's resentment crumbled into dust. Later that night, long after the girls were asleep, Ezra sat on the porch, staring out at the star-dusted infinity of the sky. The door creaked open, and Kia emerged, wrapping a thin blanket around her shoulders. She stood beside him, her presence a comforting warmth in the cool night air. For a long time they stood in silence, listening to the chirping of crickets and the distant call of an owl. "Thank you," Ezra said, his voice low. He didn't know if she would understand, but he had to say it. "For what you do for the girls." She turned to him, her face illuminated by the pale moonlight. She pointed to her own chest. "Kia." Then she pointed to his. "Ezra." It was the first time she had said his name. Then she gestured to the house, where his daughters slept. She made a motion with her hands, like a bird sheltering its young beneath its wings. Finally, she looked at him and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a simple acknowledgement, but it held a world of meaning. It said, "I see you, I see your burden, I understand." In that moment, standing under the vast, silent prairie sky, Ezra Weston realized he was no longer just sheltering a lost woman. He was sharing his life with her. The loneliness that had been his constant companion felt, for the first time, a little less absolute. But this fragile piece was a soap bubble, shimmering and beautiful, and utterly unprepared for the harsh realities of the world outside their small circle of light. The first hint of trouble came not from the open plains, but from the town of Redemption. Ezra had to ride in for supplies, flour, salt, coffee, a trip he'd put off for as long as he could. He left Abigail in charge, a heavy feeling of unease settling in his stomach. The town was a collection of dusty streets and false-fronted buildings, a place of hard-bitten men and women who viewed anything unfamiliar with deep suspicion. As he was loading his wagon outside the general store, a man named Donovan approached him. Donovan was a rancher with more land than sense and a mouth that was always twisted in a sneer of contempt. "Weston," he said, his voice oily, "heard you got yourself some company out at your place." Ezra's blood ran cold. He kept his expression neutral, hefting a sack of flour into the wagon bed. "The only company I've got is my 5 girls. You know that, Donovan." Donovan chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "That's not what I hear. My hand, Walter, was riding near your south pasture. Said he saw one of 'em, a Comanche squaw. Said she was right there by your house." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You gotta be careful, Weston. Folks round here get nervous about that sort of thing. It ain't decent, a man like you, with all them little girls, harboring a savage." Ezra's hand tightened on the wagon's side, his knuckles white. He turned to face Donovan, his eyes as hard as flint. "What I do on my own land is my business. You tell Walter to keep his eyes on your cattle and off my home." He climbed onto the wagon seat without another word and snapped the reins, leaving Donovan standing in the dust, a malicious smile playing on his lips. The ride home was fraught with a new kind of fear. It wasn't the abstract fear of loneliness or failure, but the sharp, specific terror of a known threat. Donovan's words were a poison that would spread through redemption, and Ezra knew it wouldn't be long before that poison led to action. He had to protect Kia. The thought was no longer a matter of duty, but a fierce, protective instinct that rose from the deepest part of him. When he reached the ranch, the sight of Kia in the yard, laughing as she played a game with Rose and Esther, both tightened the knot of fear in his chest and solidified his resolve. How could anyone look at this woman, at her gentleness and her quiet strength, and see a savage? That night, he tried to explain the danger. Using a piece of charcoal on a plank of wood, he drew a crude map of his ranch and the town. He drew stick figures with hats representing the townsmen and made their faces angry. He pointed from the town to the ranch, then at Kia, and shook his head, his expression grim. She understood immediately. Her face grew solemn, and a flicker of the old fear returned to her eyes. But it was quickly replaced by something else, resolve. She looked not toward the plains, toward escape, but at the 5 girls sleeping peacefully inside the cabin. Her place was here now, and she would not be run off easily. The threat from the town was a storm gathering on the horizon, but another storm was brewing from a different direction. A few days later, while riding the ridge overlooking his property, Ezra saw them. A small party of 5 riders, moving with a purpose and skill that spoke of long experience. They were not cowboys, they were Comanche. They moved with the land, not against it, their trail disciplined and direct. At their head rode a man with an air of immense authority, his face a mask of stern dignity, his hair streaked with gray. Ezra's heart hammered against his ribs. It was her people. They were looking for her. He was trapped between 2 fires, the simmering hatred of the town and the unknown intentions of the Comanche warriors. One group saw her as a threat to be eliminated. The other would see him as a captor to be punished. And in the middle of it all stood Kia and his 5 daughters, and the fragile, unspoken thing that had grown between them. He urged his horse down from the ridge, his mind racing. The quiet life he had cultivated in his isolation was about to be invaded, and he feared nothing would ever be the same. The 2 approaching threats converged on a blisteringly hot afternoon. The air was still and heavy, pregnant with a tension that mirrored the storm brewing in Ezra's soul. He had seen the Comanche party make camp in a shallow canyon 2 miles to the south. He knew they were observing, assessing. At the same time, a rider had galloped past his property an hour ago, heading back towards redemption. It could only mean one thing. Donovan had gathered his posse. Ezra stood on his porch, his Winchester rifle held loosely in his hands. He wasn't aiming it, but its weight was a grim comfort. Inside the cabin, Abigail was trying to keep the younger girls calm, her own face pale with fear. Kia stood just inside the doorway, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the track leading from town. She had put on the buckskin dress she'd been wearing when he found her, a silent declaration of who she was. She would not hide. They came as he knew they would. A dozen riders, led by Donovan, their faces a mixture of self-righteous fury and nervous excitement. They pulled up in a cloud of dust, a chaotic jumble of horses and armed men, their collective gaze filled with accusation. "Weston!" Donovan shouted, his voice ringing with false authority. "We know she's in there. Send out the Comanche squaw. We're here to deliver some proper frontier justice." "There's no justice in a mob," Ezra called back, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "This is my home. You have no business here. Ride on." "We ain't leaving without the savage," another man yelled, brandishing his pistol. "It ain't right, you keeping her here with your girls." Ezra's grip tightened on his rifle. "My girls are safer with her than they are with the likes of you. Now get off my land before you regret it." It was a standoff, a fragile moment stretched taut. The townsmen were hesitant to make the first move against a man they knew, but their numbers made them bold. Just as Donovan opened his mouth to give an order, a new sound cut through the tension, the rhythmic beat of unshod ponies. From the south, 5 riders appeared over the rise. They were the Comanche Ezra had seen, and they moved with a silent, lethal grace that made Donovan's posse look like clumsy boys playing at war. They fanned out, creating a formidable line between the ranch house and the townsmen, their faces impassive, their eyes missing nothing. The man at their head, the stern-faced chief, fixed his gaze on Ezra, then on the doorway where Kia stood. A soft gasp escaped Kia. "Father," she breathed, the word a mixture of relief and fear. The chief's eyes locked onto her, and for a moment the iron mask of his expression softened with a flicker of profound emotion. He was Kuruk, a name that commanded respect and fear across the plains. The situation had become impossibly volatile. Ezra was caught between a mob of his own people and a band of warriors whose intentions he could not know. Donovan, seeing the Comanche, seemed to find new courage in his prejudice. "See, Weston, they've come for her. They're savages, all of them." But Ezra wasn't looking at Donovan. He was looking at Kuruk. He lowered his Winchester slightly, a gesture of non-aggression, and took a step forward. He would not hide behind his rifle. He would stand as a man. "She was lost," Ezra said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. He directed his words to Kuruk, ignoring the posse. "Injured. I brought her here to heal. That is all." Before Kuruk could respond, Kia stepped out from the doorway, moving past Ezra. She walked with her head held high, her limp barely noticeable, a figure of incredible dignity. She ignored the leering faces of the townsmen and went straight to her father. She began to speak in the flowing, melodic language of the Comanche. Her voice was not pleading, but firm and clear. She gestured to the house, to the porch where the faces of Ezra's daughters were now visible, clustered together in the doorway. She pointed to her own mended ankle. Then she looked at Ezra, and her expression was one of undeniable respect and gratitude. She spoke for a long time, her words painting a picture for her father, the story of her rescue, of her healing, of the kindness she had found in this most unlikely of places. When she finished, a deep silence fell over the yard. Kuruk's gaze moved from his daughter to Ezra and then to the 5 girls huddled on the porch. He saw not a captor, but a tired man who had shown his child mercy. He saw not a prison, but a home where his daughter had been cared for. His eyes finally settled on the posse, and they were filled with a cold, undisguised contempt. He spoke a sharp command to his warriors. They shifted their positions, their lances held at the ready. Their message was unmistakable. The townsmen, who had been so bold moments before, began to fidget in their saddles. Their mob mentality evaporated in the face of true, disciplined strength. Kuruk spoke again, this time in broken but clear English, his voice like rocks grinding together. "This man," he said, nodding toward Ezra, "is a man of honor. My daughter was in his care. This is our business, not yours. Leave, now." Donovan sputtered, but the threat in Kuruk's voice was absolute. One by one, then, in a sudden, shameful rush, the men from Redemption turned their horses and rode away, their moment of righteous fury dissolving into a cloud of ignominious dust. The threat had been vanquished not by bullets, but by truth and an authority far older than the town of Redemption. The yard was quiet again, leaving only Ezra, Kia, and the Comanche warriors under the vast, watchful sky. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, Chief Kuruk dismounted. His warriors remained on their horses, silent sentinels, but his own posture relaxed slightly. He walked toward the porch, his gaze taking in every detail of the humble ranch house. He stopped before Ezra, his eyes, dark and knowing, searching the cowboy's face. "You saved my daughter," Kuruk said, the words a statement of fact, not a question. "I did what any decent man would have done," Ezra replied, his voice still hoarse with emotion. "Many decent men would have left her to die. Or worse," Kuruk countered, his gaze flicking toward the road where the posse had vanished. He looked at Kia, who stood beside Ezra now, a quiet bridge between the two men. "She has told me of this place, of your children, of your kindness." For the first time, Ezra saw Kuruk not as a fearsome chief, but as a father who had been sick with worry for his child. The relief and gratitude in his eyes were plain to see. Kuruk's gaze fell upon the 5 Western girls, who were now peeking from behind Abigail's skirts. A rare, faint smile touched his lips. "You have many daughters," he observed. "Yes, sir, 5 of them." Kuruk nodded slowly, a deep understanding dawning in his expression. He saw the whole picture, the motherless girls, the exhausted father trying to hold everything together, and his own daughter, who had found a purpose here, a place where her quiet strength was needed. He stayed for another hour, sharing a cup of water on the porch, while his men waited patiently. The conversation was sparse, translated by Kia, but a powerful understanding was forged in the silences. When it was time to leave, Kia hugged each of the girls, her farewells lingering longest with Rose and Esther. She and Ezra shared a long, searching look, a universe of unspoken emotions passing between them. Then she mounted the pony one of her father's men had brought for her and rode away, leaving behind a silence that was once again empty. The days that followed were heavy with her absence. The cabin felt too big, the chores more burdensome. The girls were listless, and even Abigail's face was clouded with a sadness she didn't try to hide. Ezra found himself staring at the rocking chair, expecting to see her there, humming her low, gentle song. The brief, fragile peace he had found was gone, and the loneliness returned with a vengeance, sharper now that he knew what its absence felt like. A week later, just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the plains, 2 riders appeared on the horizon. It was Kuruk and Kia. Ezra's heart leaped into his throat. He met them at the fence, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the gate. The girls came spilling out of the house, their faces alight with joy, shouting her name. Kia slid from her horse and was immediately engulfed in a sea of small, hugging arms. She laughed, a sound as clear and welcome as rain, and her eyes, shining with tears, found Ezra's over the heads of his daughters. Kuruk watched the scene, his face serene. He waited until the initial joyous reunion had subsided before he spoke. "Ezra Weston," he began, his tone formal, "I have come to speak with you." He gestured for Ezra to walk with him, away from the happy chatter of the girls and Kia. They stopped by the cottonwood tree that shaded Martha's grave. "My daughter was lost," Kuruk said, looking not at Ezra but at the horizon. "But in this place she found something, a home, a family that needed her." He turned to face Ezra directly. "And you, I see you are a good man, a strong man, but your heart is heavy with sorrow, and your hands are too full. A man cannot be both a father and a mother to 5 daughters. It is too much." Ezra could only nod, the truth of the words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "My daughter," Kuruk continued, his voice resonating with quiet power, "has a heart that is strong and good. She knows how to make a home from nothing. She has brought laughter back to your children, and I see in her eyes that she has brought peace to your spirit." He paused, letting his next words settle with their full weight. "It is our way sometimes to build bridges between people, to make one family from two. You are a man of honor who needs a wife. You have 5 daughters who need a mother. I have a daughter who has found a place here, a woman who looks at you with respect in her heart." He held Ezra's gaze, his proposal laid bare between them, simple and profound. "I ask you to take my daughter, Kia, as your wife, to make her the mother of your children and the keeper of your home, to build a new family, together." Ezra was stunned into silence. The proposition was so audacious, so far beyond the realm of anything he could have imagined, yet it made a strange and perfect sense. It was not a transaction of property, but a joining of needs, a weaving together of 2 broken families into a single, stronger whole. He looked over at the house. In the warm lamplight spilling from the doorway, he could see the silhouette of Kia surrounded by his daughters. Abigail was showing her a new dress she had sewn. Hannah was holding her hand, and Rose was nestled in her lap. Laughter drifted across the yard, a sound that had been so rare for so long. Kia looked up, as if she could feel his gaze, and her eyes met his across the twilight. In her expression, he saw no fear, no hesitation, only a quiet, steady hope. He looked at the grave beneath the cottonwood, a silent acknowledgement of the love and the life that had been. Martha was gone, and the grief would always be a part of him. But perhaps, he thought, a heart was big enough to hold both a memory and a new beginning. He looked back at Kuruk, then at Kia and his girls, a constellation of hope in the gathering dark. The loneliness that had defined him for so long was finally, truly beginning to recede, replaced by the terrifying, beautiful possibility of a shared future. A quiet peace settled over him, earned through hardship and discovered in the most unexpected of kindnesses. He did not have his answer yet, but for the first time in 2 years, he knew he would find it not in solitude, but in connection. He was not alone anymore.